Brief review of total depravity. It's a phrase often expressed, discussed, supported, touted, advocated, and from which a lot of conclusions are drawn and extrapolated that might not be a fair representation of it, but what is it? So before we begin, I just reference and remind you of something called category formation. It's the ability to organize information, concepts, and skills into categories. Categories are the basis of language and organization of the world, and we are all pragmatic. We like to, if you try to talk to someone about eschatology, they really don't have an interest in it except a cursory interest, perhaps knowing only the categories usually associated with eschatology. They might be able to say pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, pre-wrath. And if you really run across a few more people that might have a little more interest in it, they might be able to say preterism, historicism, futurism, but you probably aren't going to find very many people just past the first assertion, categorically speaking, the noun, the label, pre-trib. So I don't know where to find people who are interested in eschatology. Most of the time, they only are interested in supporting what they don't know about it. Such as a category, a label, a title. Met people who've asked me several things like, well, do you believe in total depravity? Well, of course you believe in total depravity. Don't you believe in total depravity? And then I was always more rather struck by how adamant they were to affirm something and then know nothing about it. But names of things, nouns, represent categories of things. So we have a lot of Bible words. So let's just look at total depravity the way we can look at it, especially language students, especially practitioners of hermeneutics, especially those of us who serve in one of the Lord's New Testament churches where we support the scriptures. So let's take a look. First of all, total depravity. Neither of the terms in English are in the Bible, so that's a start. So we now can just say this is a category, and instead of just assuming it, we can notice the limitations. We don't really have any Strong's numbers that we can look up. So now we have to find what is the term from which depravity is derived. First occurrence, let's say, as a practitioner of hermeneutics, we want to know where's the first occurrence or use of this word in the Old Testament, let's say Hebrew. And you might think of Isaiah where he was speaking of the punishment, the afflictions of Christ, bruised for our iniquities, and maybe look that up and start doing that. But to find the term that others who adamantly affirm it are referring to which they're referring might be impossible. So that's quite relative. And total, that's an adjective that's added to this. And you have to then ask the person, do you mean the totality of depravity is attributed to an individual person, or are we talking about the total man being depraved, mind and spirit and body? So they really probably haven't thought about that, as one person said. Most people would rather just have a few things to assert and then just get on with their lives anyway. The teachings, the Bible, the scriptures, the implications, substantive conversation, substantial knowledge, to grow in grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ is not really something people practice. Now that's not to discourage you who do, because for example, myself, I have my own interest in the scriptures, and I teach the Bible, and I represent Christ, and I'm an ambassador for Him. So as a pastor of one of his churches, feeder of the flock, an under shepherd, if you will, the good shepherd who lords over our church, I take the words, the categories that are inspired by God, because total depravity is not a category in the Bible. And that's an interesting start if you just ask yourself, before we get going too far down this road. So let's look at it. First of all, we now have, as I would say, let's set it up as an if-then. So we have, if total depravity is true, then what? And what we want to do is, here's the main clause, this apodosis, which is the clause that contains the conclusion, and then this protasis. And no, you won't run across people. I was reading one linguistic site, and They said people whom you would never wish to befriend will call the conditional sentence the protasis. So it's funny if you think about it, but it's not if you're actually a teacher. And then those of you that participate in Koine University or subscribe to the iamkoine.org, you'll find that a lot of pain and agonies out there and angst by people who tout total depravity but don't take responsibility to substantiate first the implication. Find two people that advocate it that refer to the same Hebrew word or Hebrew word, since we have two terms, and what's the adjective from which the word total is being used, and what's the noun from which depravity has been established, and then go to your New Testament. Now, Strong's number system helps that quickly because let's say you're not a user of Greek or Hebrew. You can be. Go to blueletterbible.org and you can search these things out and take a Bible app, for example, and in just a moment find that, oh, I can't find these words in English. So begin there, try to find some consistency. But let's say if this is true, then what? Well, now you have no free will. This is where a lot of the energy comes from. The libertarianism is one of the assertions of free will. It's I don't know what it is. I don't even know how to define it. I know it's a philosophy that's been developed. Libertarian, and of course, ism, that's just a word. And what you now have is you can't really have a free will. And then you get into that thing of Luther had a bound will, a doctrine called the bound will. And now what you've got is a no free will, and now you have a bound will. And of course, those are adjectives that aren't found in the Bible ascribed to the will of man. And the Bible in Ephesians, I remind you, especially this class, and people actually are interested, we have wills of the mind, plural, wills, plural, and wills of the flesh, where Paul told the church at Ephesus that we at one time fulfilled both the desires of the mind and of the flesh. Now that would be an interesting, well, I've studied that before, and we can go over it in class sometimes. Multiple wills of the flesh and multiple wills of the mind. So we really, it just starts getting very much a jargon now forms, terminologies that can't be found in the Bible. Libertarianism, that's a philosophical concept. So now if total depravity, then not this, but then others say, well, no, I believe in total depravity, but I believe in free will, which now that means total depravity holds two different implications. So no free will, a bound will, or number two, that is one, let me just make it 1.2. The second point of, I can do this, I can make it 1.5. So 1.5, someone can then say, well, I believe in total depravity and I believe in free will. Again, I'm not sure, I left an E out, but then they believe in free will, but now they have to pick one of these versions of it. And one of the negative externalities that I've learned and that we've noticed as a class and as a group of people who work together now in the scriptures, we noticed that causal agency is totally omitted. That's a negative externality. Causal agency is one of the causal active stems in the biblical Hebrew, where it literally says, Genesis 15:6, Abram caused faith, Abram caused himself, Abram, first subject, caused himself, second subject, to believe. And you can look all that up in the Walty O'Connor Hebrew syntax and grammar introduction to syntax, Hebrew syntax. You can look it up on blueletterbible.org. Just go to Genesis 15:6, go to the verb believe and click, and it'll tell you it's Hiphil and it's causal, it's active, and that'll just tell you that one of the negative externalities is a lot of people, if you hear noise, they're having Koine flag football sports registration, so they're right outside my room here. So if you hear living people out there playing and laughing, they're registering for Koine football and cheer. Anyway, so a lot of people, you have a lot more people that talk total depravity and then reserve the right to, well, I believe in total depravity, but free will, as if somehow asserting total depravity maintains their orthodoxy. I don't know what that means. How can something undefined that's not a category in the Bible be a determinant in orthodoxy? But alas, we're not surprised that in religion, like politics, remember class, we seldom run across someone who says they're a Democrat and the first thought we have is they must have a Bachelor of Science in political science. Or if someone says they're a Republican, it doesn't immediately occur to us to even suppose that they majored in political science or somehow are a professor in it or even a student of it. They just have their partisanship, Green Party, independent parties, whatever all that is. So it's the threshold of entry is very low. So to tout total depravity and then to proof text it and to backload that concept, it allows for a very orthodox, you could almost feel it. Now I don't, it doesn't transfer to me because I wasn't primed when I attended the seminary prior to. And so when I attended seminary, all I knew was what I was taught from the Bible words, my Greek lexicon and my Hebrew lexicon. So as the idea of category formation even observes, names of things, nouns represent categories. So I had all the categories I needed from the Bible words, which are the new glossary that's preached and taught in New Testament churches, new being unprecedented, not different glossary like people speak of different tongues. We're talking about new glossary, the unprecedented words, which are the categories of the Lord's churches. So go to one of the Lord's churches, you'll find that our categories are the ones in the Bible that are inspired and for us to use and to teach. And one thing I did find encouraging in observation by educators, trained educators like myself, is that there are children out there, young people, who just spontaneously, that is naturally, innately, have no use for so many categories. And that's interesting because I never really found a lot of these categories that men formed and then became traditions and then became the glossary, the different glossaries. I never found them useful. I was so much, my opinion of the Bible, the scriptures, and the context, the word meanings, the etymologically derived words, and syntax and grammar and context, of course. And then if you forget context, always remember your context and then use context as a reminder of context to remind you of context. So we've lost sight in this conversation, causal agency. So it's probably not useful because it doesn't do anything for this. Another externality or a conclusion, if total depravity, then regeneration must precede faith. And of course, on the other hand, there's people who say, no, I believe in total depravity, but I don't accept regeneration preceding faith. And what will be missed is no distinction between a finite verb and participle, as in John 20:31. The gospel was written, and the narratives, the attesting miracles were written in its perfect tense and remain on record, have been written and remain on record. Now, you can look that up, just like you look up a noun, you can look up the verb. And don't be discouraged by people who don't want to. If you don't want to, then don't want to. But if you are a student of scriptures, you can enjoy learning the implication and the value of the gospel. Is that it was all the attesting miracles of Jesus, the contextualized narratives of all the gospels, including John, but namely John's gospel, for example, in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, finite verb. And then he says, and as one who is believing, now that's a participle describing a person, a gerundive noun, and that is what you are as one who had previously believed. Now it says in 1 John 5:1, for example, in supporting total depravity that demands regeneration must precede faith, 1 John 5:1 has often been used, especially by the great Dr. James White, unsurpassed scholar in both language, hermeneutic. I don't know any field of the Bible in which he is not currently a leader, the leader, if not, he might have contemporaries. I don't know who they would be. I've not heard of them. but he used 1 John 5:1 to demonstrate the antecedent action, the perfect tense. Says everyone who is believing that Jesus is the Christ has been previously, antecedent action, born, fathered out from God. However, that's a participle. So of course the believer, the one who is believing, has as his father God. But I noticed in the New King James Version, they've changed that to believes, aorist tense, which is because of the bias of total depravity. It's close. Now, I will not disparage even Dr. White's use there of 1 John 5:1. It's just, it's a big deal in the Koine text, a finite verb and participle, because if total depravity is true, then there's also this over here, no gospel prior to or through which someone's fathered. And there's a lot of people who teach correctly. Their understanding, that is, they're consistent with total depravity, which means there's no regeneration. I notice Al Mohler of the Southern Baptist Convention had to come back and state that, oh yes, you need the gospel. Well, the gospel is a little more important than, oh yeah, let's not forget that. And it should never be the case with any type of ministry, evangelical Christians, which is the word used for those in the Lord's New Testament church, for example. There should never be a situation where something becomes so primary that we have to incidentally, oh, by the way, let's not forget the gospel. Let's throw that in. So if total depravity is true as people teach it in the, let's say, the construct Calvinism, then regeneration must take place apart from the gospel, because there's no ability to believe the gospel, you see. So the gospel is not the power, for example. But then you have, what about 1 Corinthians 4:15, where Paul said, you might have myriad of teachers, but you only have one Father. For I fathered you, he, the preacher, fathered, that's the verb, you all through the gospel. So the instrument and means through which they were generated was the gospel. So we have a lot of things we could conclude, but these negative externalities, this banner between abound and free will, that's like total depravity. These categories don't exist in the Bible. That is, free doesn't exist separately as an adjective. And if you look that word up, in some cases it means exempt. So there's nothing that we are, from which we're exempt in the fall. No part of us was exempt, and no part of us is exempt from finitude. So when we were originally created, we were all finite. Now we being born, reproduced in the image and likeness of Adam, if you go read that in Genesis, we are not reproduced as he was originally created in the image and likeness of God, except then we have the appeal today that Jeff Durbin is making, and even Dr. James White on behalf of unborn children, because to us, they're image bearers of God, and there is an image of God. We are, those humans are God's reflection of his image. So that somewhere in there, the balance is lost because of what happens when you just begin to say, well, you're unorthodox if you don't support total depravity. And I've heard people on both sides of the will issue, free and bound, people are both libertarian, compatibilistic, people who, well, neither even care about causal agency. I've heard people who say regeneration must precede it, and others say not, but they all make sure they go get back in their corner, and they all say, but now we all support total depravity, as if somehow that primer has become so significant as a signal to indicate orthodoxy that even the organizing pastor of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, Dr. L.D. Foreman, put in his book, The Church Jesus Built, he said one of the things to know if it's a gospel church or a New Testament church is, do they preach total depravity? Well, how do you qualify that? Because, again, you won't find too many people that recognize that if and then sentences, clauses in the Bible, those are inspired. We have the conditional particles, we have the arrangements and all that we can stand in the Bible. We have the knowledge of causal agency so that we don't need abstract assertions, and we don't need these two philosophies. We certainly don't want anything here, whatever this is, an attribute of man, to trump the relevance of the gospel, because the gospel is about Jesus Christ. Now, whatever this anthropological assertion is, it's about man. So here, I'll help you. There we go. Now, that takes care of total depravity. And what we'll do is place the gospel here. There we go. There. Now you can start. And now you can get into if and then, and you can talk about Jesus, the gospel, the finished work, his obedience unto death, even death, the cross, the kinesis of Christ, where he emptied himself. We can then discuss the hypostatic union, the hypostases, that's a Bible word. We can discuss the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the 3 in 1. Those are words in the Bible. We can discuss the kinsman redemption. That's in the Bible, not universal redemption, not particular. Those again are categories. And then you won't even know you won't notice that people don't know where kinsman redemption is taught. What does it mean? They won't know that, for example, John 3:16, there's dispute over, for God so loved the world, and he loved the world in a manner that found him giving his only begotten, monogenetic, that's an adjective, only related son. He was never generated. He was the always related, only related son. Monogenetic, that's an adjective, for example. And you say, well, he gave his only begotten son, monogenetic, only related son, so that everyone who's already believing might not self-destruct, be destroyed, perish. But now that was written in order that those who would read that would then deliberately cause ourselves to believe that Jesus is the Christ. It didn't say in order that the particular elect class or select class would do it, but rather in order that those who read and hear it and listen to it. So there's a lot about the gospel that if we put it in its proper place and said, well, are you Orthodox or not? Do you believe people are fathered, generated through the gospel? Yes or no? Do you believe that there's a difference between the finite verb, the act to believe, by an unregenerate? Yes, the Bible teaches. And then the person who does becomes a believer, one who's always believing. Do we recognize the purpose of the gospel? Do we accept causal agency? Well, now all of a sudden we haven't left the gospel out. We don't care about man's, these two abstract, competing, opposing, bound and free concepts. Matter of fact, I don't think the phrase free will even exists in the Bible. I think there's a word, free will offering, which means an undesignated offering. So I'm not sure why there's so much work here. There are texts that would help us, but that's not what this topic's about. I'm just trying to use the language of the conflict. But if you're teaching something, let's say total depravity, whatever that is, apparently no one knows, but if you're teaching that and it finds causal agency nullified and irrelevant, if it says the gospel's irrelevant in regeneration, if it says, well, you don't need to know the difference between a finite verb, the act of an unregenerate to believe the gospel, or a participle, and things like that, then you probably just don't need it. So I haven't found it necessary, and I don't need to tout it to find myself in Orthodox circles. Why would I want to be run with circles that don't support the Bible? Why would I need to be, as an evangelist, around people who don't find the key to the evangelist's work? I don't get that. I don't know why I would want to tout something to send out orthodox signals. Depravity of total man, that's probably better if we want to look at it that way, as Dr. W.A. Dillard teaches so much more astutely, is let's look at where you're placing that adjective. Now that would be an interesting approach, and it's very astute and insightful for those people who view the names of things, the nouns in the Bible, for example, as that which represents categories of things that should capture we have enough categories in the Bible with which to find ourselves occupied until Jesus comes, rather than categories that men have formed with which so many are so preoccupied. So that's enough. That's plenty of time to cover total depravity.